Can I ask members for nominations for chairman of SACRE, please?
May I nominate Councillor Saville?
Before we start, I guess, we are nominating a chairman for what period, David? Can you just confirm? Is it for a year or?
Yeah, usually the nomination will be for a year.
Okay.
And then it will be renewed if necessary after that time. Well, you may be here because you could be in the public gallery.
Thank you for that nomination. Do we have a seconder, first of all? Do we have a seconder or any other nominations?
I'll second the third.
Do we have any other nominations? 3, 2, no. Councillor Saville, please take the chair. Congratulations.
You're not allowed to. I'm not member of these committees. Sorry, Christine, I laughed because I thought you were just eager to get rid of the role. I didn't realise you were willing to. Yeah, that's all right. So sorry, Molly, that's why I was laughing. I didn't realise.
Well, thank you all very much. I am willing to serve on this committee for my final year as a member of this council, and I will endeavour to serve you as best as my ability. So thank you very much. And we move on to item 2, which is the election of a vice chairman for the ensuing year. Can I have nominations? Of course, 2 of our members of the committee will soon be leaving us, and Kevin's been the previous vice chairman, so it wouldn't be appropriate to elect Kevin into the role. Doesn't have to be a elected member. And Charlie's also leaving us. I am looking at a certain person at that end of the table.
Chairman.
In fact, if I may, Madam Chairman, in terms of chair and vice chair, constitutionally, if you have a chair from one group, the vice chair must be from a different group.
Yeah.
Chairman, could you briefly explain what might be expected of a vice chair so that it might not scare them off too much?
Well, obviously, a vice chair chairs any meetings that I'm unable to be present at, but it's not a great onerous job to my experience. Even chairman is not particularly onerous in this role. So, do I have the Reverend Perrin Gay volunteering?
I'm very happy to do that, actually. I can't come to the next meeting, so I hope you can make the next meeting.
Yes,
I'm relieved this is number 2 and not number 1, actually, so I thought I might get lumbered even with that. So I'm very relieved to receive number 2. Thank you.
So can we have a formal nomination and seconder, please?
I'll second.
I'll
nominate.
Yes, thank you.
And I'll second.
Thank you, Kevin. Right. Thank you. Welcome, Perrin. Thank you for that. Right, we move on to item 3, declarations of interest. No declarations?
As usual, I'm a foundation governor of the Five Islands School.
Thank you, Perrin. Thank you. No other declarations? Item 4 is to confirm as a correct record the minutes of the meeting of the SACRE on December the 7th and the 17th of March. The 7th ones have just been circulated. I hope members have had an opportunity to have a quick look through.
Chairman, if I may, they're relatively short, so
Yeah.
if people want to take a minute or two to scan read them, I know it's not the best way of doing it.
December ones. We've had the March ones previously. Oh, Perrin hasn't got the December ones, Andy, are they? There might be some next. They were emailed out yesterday.
Yeah, my apologies for that.
Could I just propose an addition to the minute SAC 2915,
You may.
which is the second paragraph. If I remember rightly, but was an unfortunate way to illustrate it.
It's refused to turn.
Was refused to turn up, which they did. But in fact, what their argument was, if I remember rightly, that because that's all right. Yeah, that's fine. That because the Department for Education had not received complaints about collective worship, they didn't believe that there was a problem with it, the result being that they saw there was no reason to change. So the idea with the DFE that presented there in their statement that came to the conference from the DFE was that there was no reason to change because parents appeared to be content with the current settlement.
And you wish that to be
Yeah.
replaced, that. Have you got that, Andy?
Yeah. Do you want that added or replacing?
I think it's just a sort of a clarity. The Department of Education did refuse to turn up. Which seemed to imply the impression there was no change necessary because there was nothing coming from parents to indicate that there should be any change. But this was an unfortunate way to illustrate it.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Are there any other further amendments that members wish to make? If not, can I have a proposal that we accept them with the amendment from David as a correct record? Yes, thank you, Kev.
Yes, I'll propose them.
Thank you. Seconded by Perrin. All in favour, please show. Thank you. It's carried. And we move now to the minutes of the 17th of March, which were in the pack. I have a confession here because I think on page 2, the letter to the government from I don't think it went. The third resolution. Oh, did you do it, David?
I think, because I think we picked this up in this agenda, I'm not so sure that that did happen, partly
No.
because the government then announced a U-turn on that particular proposal.
Right, yes. Yes, they did.
So I think that was the thing that was particularly interesting, that they had said that by 2020 all schools will become academies.
Now they've done a bit of a change, yes.
Yeah, and what didn't happen, as comes up in one of the reports for today, is that, of course, they announced that as a fiscal measure before they announced it in the white paper. And then within weeks of the white paper being published, they then went back on that requirement.
But that was a decision that was taken, so as the correctness of the
Yes,
of the minutes, it should still remain.
yeah.
Any further amendments? Can I have a proposal, please? Thank you, Molly.
I'll propose.
Thank you. Seconder? Thank you, Pam. All in favour, please show. Thank you. Right, minutes done. Item 5, urgent items. I have no urgent items, but I would like to welcome Sam Grossett to her first meeting of SACRE. Welcome, Sam. I presume you know us all around the table. Yes,
So
thank you.
can I just for clarification for the minute? Sam Grosset is Keith's daughter. Is that right? just checking. Yeah.
No. So welcome, Sam, and I would also say it's good to see Chairman of Council and Councillor Mrs Mumford in the public gallery, so welcome to you as well. Item 6, public questions.
I have none.
No public questions, good. So we move to part 1, reports requiring a decision. Item 7, non-religious worldviews and religious education. And we have a report from David.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I mean, the report is there for everybody to read. What I would say is that there's all schools, other than those where religious education will be determined by the governing body, will have received an email from the British Humanist Association, or so they have told us, which contains the humanism resource for schools, Understanding Humanism, and also the appended legal advice of Dr. Satvinder Jus on the High Court ruling on religious education. What it states is that it is now a legal requirement that as part of religious education all pupils learn about non-religious worldviews, and it is of the opinion of Dr. Jus that the Mr. Justice Warby ruling also would indicate strongly that if you teach about a minority religious tradition like the Baha'i tradition or something like that, you would then also have to teach about humanism, because there would be some sort of an equivalence. This also went to all clerks of SACRE, we believe. That's what the British Humanist Association told us. And it has caused some issues nationally in terms of how people have responded to this, because the indication is from the advice and from the communication from the British Humanist Association that they will be looking to take local authorities to court where humanism was excluded from, or non-religious worldviews which include humanism, were excluded from the locally agreed syllabus, which schools then have to follow. In light of that, myself, as the chair of the National Association of Sacres, but also Dilwyn Hunt, the chair of the Association of RE Advisors, Inspectors and Consultants, looked at the advice, went back to the Lord Justice, Mr. Justice Warby ruling, but also contacted the DFE, because I think what was quite interesting in the sending out of this to schools and to Sacres, particularly with the appended legal advice, they had purposefully cut the DFE out of the loop. And this irritated, you don't have to mean it this exactly, this irritated the DFE no end, who went into slight overdrive. So what NASACRE and ARIAC have produced is a piece of guidance which are on page 13 and 14 of your agenda. That says, actually, Dr. Justice's advice is the advice of a single lawyer. It's his opinion. It's not saying it's not a valid opinion, but it is an opinion. That actually you can read the Mr. Justice Warby ruling in a different way from the way that he's read it. And we've had our lawyers look at that. Interestingly, though, is the statement from the DFE itself. And the DFE have come out very strongly against this particular advice by Dr. Just, but also the manner in which it was sent out to schools. Since then, since this report was written, another piece of advice has come out from Dr. Just to justify his particular statement here. But that's not been circulated to schools, local authorities or Sacres, because I think they realise in terms of PR, this probably wasn't the wisest thing that they did. That notwithstanding, I do think it is important to go back in terms of the main body of the report. At the moment, the awareness, mystery and value, which is the agreed syllabus used by, adopted by the Council of the Isles of Scilly, does not require the study of non-religious worldviews. The revised, when we come on to the ASC meeting, the revised one does, both the Somerset version and the non-Somerset version of those particular, of that syllabus itself. So the question is, in terms of risk to the council, this is the key question in a sense here. It's unlikely, to be honest, that the British Humanist Association are going to be taking 154 different authorities to court. It's just not practical to be able to do that. Having said that, there is a serious question about to what extent should non-religious worldviews themselves play in the religious education of pupils. It was certainly the case that Mr. Justice Warby felt that under European legislation that there would be an expectation that there would be an opportunity to study non-religious worldviews. Of course, very soon we may not be part of the European Union, so that it might be a moot point. So who knows either way. But I do think that in terms of Sacre, to refer this to the agreed syllabus conference, I think actually would be quite useful to say this is something that needs to be part of the thinking of the way forward for religious education on the Isles. Not just what religions are going to be taught, but also the place of non-religious worldviews. And when that happens, in terms of the curriculum offer for pupils within the school. You might want to say that as well in terms of those people who on the Isles, in terms of the census data, who didn't identify themselves with a particular religious tradition, which doesn't mean to say they identify themselves with humanism, but I think it's useful to sort of ask that question. So the recommendation is that Sacre note the guidance of Dr. Just and the response by Nasakre Ariak, and that whilst it wouldn't happen at the next meeting, in any future meeting, the SACRE passed this guidance onto the agreed syllabus conference in terms of thinking about the shape of the agreed syllabus of the future.
Thank you. Any comments? Yes, Baron?
I'm just a little bit confused from your main report. What am I looking at? Yes, item 721 on page 5. I can understand that the second comment about if you're teaching minority religions, you need to teach humanism. But I'd just be grateful for a little more clarification what the earlier part of that sentence means. That because we are technically without a religious foundation, being a VC school, I think in this sense, aren't we? Religious education curriculum must include the teaching of non-religious worldviews on a par with the teaching of the principal religions in Great Britain. I don't quite know what that means. I understand the subsidiary point about humanism and minorities and stuff, but we are surely teaching principal worldviews. Every school is teaching principal religions, and so that's seems to be a big statement.
Yes, if I may, Madam
Yes,
Chairman,
certainly, please do.
that is the advice of Dr. Juss, which is, that's what he's saying, which is challenged in 2.2 in terms of Appendix 2. But I do think it's a really useful point to ask, what are non-religious worldviews that they can be taught? Now, in terms of British law, or English and Welsh law at the moment, there are only 2 non-religious worldviews other than humanism which have been recognised. And those are vegetarianism and veganism. So there is a sort of a question whether or not, and these go back to the rulings of the European Commission, the European Court on Human Rights, there is a question as to what constitutes a non-religious worldview. And one of the weaknesses, I think, of the Just advice is that there's no clarity about what that is at all. So would that include Marxism? Would it include, there are 2 sorts of non-religious worldviews that get me really excited. One is hedonism, and I could go for hedonism. For me, that sounds good. Or if I was economically more secure, I would go for Epicureanism. Yeah, I think those would be, the finer things in life. And I think part of the weakness of the argument is, whilst it's broadly possible, in fact, what the confusion here, it seems to me, is what the law requires is that an agreed syllabus is about the teaching of Christianity and the principal religions represented in Great Britain. So it's not the teaching of religion as a sort of an amorphous concept that is akin to non-religion as an amorphous concept. It's about the teaching of specific traditions. In the law, there's no concept of religion which is not tied into religions in the specific. But here in the Just ruling and the Mr. Justice Warby ruling, there's almost a concept of non-religion as if it was something. Now, I think there's a significant category mistake. And I think that's part of the weakness of the overall advice, because what is a non-religious worldview? And in fact, what the Mr. Justice Warby judgment quite clearly states is that it's parity of esteem, not parity of time. So what you can't do is you can't say that to have a religious worldview is somehow superior to having a non-religious worldview. But in terms of, and that will be covered in the Equalities Act 2010, but it doesn't expect parity of time. And in fact, Mr. Justice Warby actually counsels against that.
Yes, Perrin.
I'm going to take exception to Epicureanism just being described as a non-religious view. As actually most Romans who are Epicureans were religious people. Actually, that's not. But the main point, though, is that actually there is nothing else to study but humanism that makes sense, that's actually coherent. So, in a way, if you're going to study a non-religious worldview, you end up surely looking at humanism, which is an organised thing. It actually has things arguing the case for itself. The things you can read, and just as Christians want to argue their point, so do humanists, rather than some amorphous thing that might be vaguely veganism. That seems a bit odd.
I would not disagree at all. So if I may, I wouldn't disagree at all. I'd also, as well, I would recommend a Theos publication, The Case for Christian Humanism. The idea that humanism itself is necessarily an atheistic or agnostic tradition, there's a particular appropriation of the word. But I do think what's quite difficult as well, if I can just find it, is the fundamental, this is from the Amsterdam Declaration of 2002. I'm just trying to find the exact when you look at it, it says that humanism, the Amsterdam Declaration of 2002, says that in paragraph 4 of the declaration, that humanism is undogmatic, imposing no creed upon its adherents. Now, if you sort of argue that humanism is a belief, but it's a belief with no creed, what sort of belief is it? And I think that's quite an interesting thought, because if you want to sort of look at humanism as a belief system, it's actually saying there is no belief system in humanism, which I find really quite peculiar. It's not quite the stance taken by the British Humanist Association, but the British Humanist Association is actually signed up to that definition.
Kevin, you wish to come in?
Yeah. Humanism has been knocking at the door of schools, not just RE, for a long, long time. If you think about it, how do schools decide what they teach? What we teach to our kids is decided. And at the moment, there is this vacuum that is filled with PSHE, it's filled with SMSC, it's filled with our school values of having the believe and achieve. And I think what people are saying is that space in kids' lives, which is now not filled in the main by religious belief and values, has got to come from somewhere else. And humanism has been saying, why don't you let us into the curriculum somewhere? And increasingly kids see religion as something they study that is objective and is out there. That's why you have religious studies as opposed to religious education. Now, what is it to be religiously educated? And I think to be religiously educated does involve things like values and morals. And I might disagree that if someone had said to me, what is humanism? I think I could sum it up. The word creed is a strange word, but I would suggest you can work out what it is. And I think I do a disservice to my kids if I don't say, I know a lot of you aren't religious and believe in a God, but there's nothing else for you to hang your values on. And I think humanism offers that. And it always has been there, and it's a shame that we have not found a real place for it. And that's why it keeps on knocking at the door. When I went to the SE conference before, there was a guy from humanism there, and all the time he was saying, what about? And I think we have to and if you look at item 9, for instance, it's talking about the name change for religious education. Changing it, because it has to be more inclusive. And I think humanism does have a valid place. And where it sits in the curriculum is another issue. Whether it sits in the subject of RE, that might be debatable, because everybody wants to protect their little space, don't they? You know, religion for a lot of kids is an objective study of something that happens out there. Studying of a religion. Being spiritual and being something that drives you as a person is a different dimension altogether. And I think that is where humanism can come in, which doesn't, for a lot of our kids who are now very much kind of secular and science-based, have the idea of an ultimate reality out there. It's something that values humans and humanity for itself and each other. And I wouldn't like to see humanism as kind of like, again, pushed away by SAC. I think we do have to consider it when we're talking about the RE syllabus, but I know we're constrained by our own definition of what religious education is. And that's why you can't separate it from item 9, which is about a new vision for worship, a new vision for what religious education is all about. You know, an all-embracing approach to things. So I think it is a tricky thing, and anyway, that's
Thanks.
just...
Erin, did you want to come back?
Just briefly, I mean, my experience of working with the British Humanist Association, I had for many years actually working at the cathedral. We had an annual, biannual service organised by Penn Mount to remember those who died and those whose services had been at the crematorium for those past 2 years. And in recent years, we'd always welcomed participation from the local humanist group. And the sort of stuff which was offered was totally in keeping with Christian values, apart from using any words about God or kind of ultimate reality. It was talking about a vision of human life which we shared, to be honest, which is not far from what the kingdom of God is about as Jesus taught it. So apart from the aggressive atheistic kind of claim, by some humanists, it's just something to be applauded, because it's actually getting at the heart of something about values that everybody shares, which is part of what the interfaith whole process is about as well. So it's a complicated one, really. I don't even think it isn't in a sense religious. It's about unpacking a vision of human life, which is shared by the religions, mostly.
Thank you. Any further comments? We have 2 recommendations, as David has said. One that we note, which I believe we have, and that we forward this advice to the Agreed Syllabus Conference. Can I just have a quick proposer and a seconder that we do that? I think it's important, the second one, that we do actually do that. Thank you. Molly, thank you. In favour, please show. Thank you. It's carried. We move to item 8, the White Paper, Educational Excellence Everywhere, Implications for SAC rates and Religious Education. Again, a report from David. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The White Paper, Educational Excellence Everywhere, was published in March. It signalled, as we've already mentioned, that in terms of responding to the minutes of the previous meeting, that that all schools were going to become academies by 2020 or 2021, something like that, and the government have pulled back on that. Having said that, that wasn't the only issue that was raised by the White Paper itself. So what this report does is highlight 2 specific issues in terms of the work of SACRE. As a caveat to that, I would say, though, whilst the government has pulled back on the idea of forced academisation, it still has the aspiration that all schools will become academies. The other interesting thing is that the Education and Adoption Act 2016 quite clearly states that coasting schools will be made to become an academy. That coasting academy is not currently part of a multi-academy trust, will be made to join a multi-academy trust. And those currently part of a multi-academy trust, where they are coasting, will be moved to another multi-academy trust where they may coast again. May improve. Which I find quite interesting, particularly as there is no definition of what a coasting school is in law. There's guidance about that. A school which requires improvement and is not improving, that could be coasting. But you are left with a peculiar situation that if you had a high-achieving grammar school which had 100% A stars at GCSE and at A level every year for 3 years, it could not show any improvement, therefore it must be coasting. And people say, no, that's stupid. But actually, it's not, because in fact that's what the statute says. Because the statute doesn't define what coasting means. And I think that's a really peculiar thing to be. But the two implications from the white paper that affect SACRE, firstly, is to do with the proposed reform of local authorities. So it talks about the changing role of local authorities, it has a sort of a vision of how local authorities will work with schools as advocates for children and for their parents. It obviously sees local authorities still having a crucial role in safeguarding, but it gives no indications as to what's going to happen to SACREs or agreed syllabus conferences, which are appointed by the local authority as statutory bodies on the basis of current legislation. And one of the concerns is that whoever drafted the white paper just did not think that local authorities had any broader role anymore than ensuring school places, monitoring school improvement, in terms of the interests of children and their families, and safeguarding. So this leaves SACREs and ASCs in a very peculiar place, and also local authorities in a very peculiar place, because they don't know what's going to go on. Now, interestingly, there was an exchange between the Lord Bishop of Ely and the Minister of State for Education in the House of Lords, if I remember rightly, about religious education and about SACREs. And the government came out strongly in the House of Lords that SACREs are seen to be very important. They have a crucial role to play, and the government supports them. But quite where that fits in with the white paper, it is quite unclear. So that's one area. So the part of the recommendation is to write to the department to say to ask it to spell out what the implications are for SACREs and agreed syllabus conferences. We do know that there have been some really anomalous situations. So if you take an authority which is not dissimilar to the Isles of Scilly, although geographically not very similar at all, other than if the Thames Barrier failed, the City of London has no school which has to follow a locally agreed syllabus or listen to the advice of SACRE. So the City of London Authority decided to mothball, effectively, its SACRE and not to review the agreed syllabus. When the DfE became aware of this situation, the DfE issued a notice of compliance. So now the City of London Authority has had to re-establish its SACRE and has had to review its agreed syllabus. And it's now doing that, working with Greenwich, I think, But it's a very peculiar situation. So what the DFE are saying is the law is the law and you've got to follow it. But actually, other bits of law and policy don't really fit in with this at all. But that doesn't matter because you've still got to follow what the law says. So I do think it is useful to, for SACRE to ask for clarity on this particular issue. The other issue that comes up, which does affect the SACRE, because it's traditionally been part of SACRE's remit, is the training of teachers, particularly the initial teacher training. It's in the best interests of SACREs, and this has been recognised in guidance from 1994 and the 2010 guidance as well, that SACREs do have a stake in ensuring that teachers are prepared through their initial teacher training to be able to deliver religious education. There's always been an anomaly here because initial teacher education institutions, in order for teachers to get qualified teacher status, don't have to show that teachers are competent in teaching religious education. They do in terms of the national curriculum, but not religious education, because no teacher has to teach religious education. They all have the right to withdraw. So working with the Teacher Development Agency, and previous to that the Teacher Standards Agency, now which have all become part of the National College, it's been very important to say, actually, it may not be a requirement that teachers teach religious education, but it seems rather strange that you would have somebody who's very competent in teaching the national curriculum, and that would be fine to set them on schools, but not religious education, where they could be doing untold damage, So they've shored up those regulations. But I do think it is quite important to get some sort of a purchase on what these changes imply for religious education and how prepared teachers will be to deliver religious education in the future, particularly as they are proposing that they're going to replace the current PGCE QTS standards with something which is more intellectually rigorous, something which has got higher levels of expectations around subject knowledge. Well, what does that mean? What are the implications of that in terms of people being prepared for teaching? The other question is, what about continuous professional development as well in this area, which also SACRE has a stake in as well. But that's not quite within the remit of the local authority. So, sorry, with the SACRE, it is with the local authority, but not with SACRE. So I do think it's, the white paper poses some really interesting questions for SACRE. Firstly, what does the reform of local authorities imply for SACREs and agreed syllabus conferences in their future? Secondly, if you're moving initial teacher training increasingly out of higher education institutions, except for the very, very top ones, that's the implication that's the statement in the paper, and all initial teacher education is going to be school-based for the main part, what's the implication of that? And I think one of the anxieties that SACRE can have is around the whole teaching school model. You only have to look at what happened on the mainland in terms of Callington School, Callington Community School last year, which did have teaching school status, lost its teaching school status because it moved from an outstanding school to being an inadequate school in the matter of about 6 weeks altogether. But even so, an outstanding school like that, where it was as a teaching school, was recognised actually that there was virtually no religious education going on in the school. Well, if you could actually go there and train to be a teacher there and do religious, it doesn't follow that because the school is outstanding. It's outstanding in all areas of the curriculum for it to be able to pass on that subject knowledge and pedagogical skills.
Erin.
Two questions, one serious, one frivolous. The serious one on 2.4 and what you've just been talking about really, I just wonder if the broadening of RE to include humanism and the move from collective worship to times for reflection and the loss of the opt-out, as it were, for parents, whether that would then be paralleled in the loss of an opt-out for teachers. So actually, this is now a reasonable thing that you're studying because it's a much broader-based thing. It's not presuming your own religious views, but it's really important that you look at the whole thing. That's the serious one. The frivolous one is whether in penning 2.5 you had an Epicurean moment.
Oh, I may have done.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, for some reason, I don't know why that happened. Sorry, for some reason, I don't know why that happened. But you're right. It may have been at that moment I decided to go for my morning glass of champagne. So I think it should read something that, SACRIG is with the recommendation. It will be asking significant questions of the Department for Education. I think that's probably what I would have said. But I think, if I might go back, Madam Chairman,
Yes.
I think there are a number of implications in terms of initial teacher training. I think one is if there was a national syllabus for RE or a national curriculum order for RE, then teachers would have to show, in order to be able to get QTS, would have to show that they were competent in the delivery of it. I think one of the difficulties is, and in fact, it has been an argument for a number of years that because on the whole religious education in community schools and voluntary control schools is not of a confessional nature, unless in community schools parents specifically ask for that and there are retained teachers for that purpose, then why should people be exempt from teaching it? And I think there's a very reasonable question there. I think one of the difficulties is, and I think when you start talking to people who draft legislation, what's very difficult is for them to draft legislation which distinguishes between different types of schools. So let's say, for instance, you go down the Clark-Woodhead route, that there would be a national syllabus for RE, as we looked at in the last meetings, or back in December, I think. If you look at that and say, right, anybody who delivers the national curriculum for RE, or the national syllabus for RE, in those schools where that's delivered, there would be no opt-out for parents. Let's say, for instance, you decided you could do something better for that was equally non-confessional, but you decided not to follow it, parents would have the right to withdraw. The other problem is, how would you monitor that? How would anybody know that that was actually what was being delivered? And I think there's an interesting question there in terms of it's presuming quite a lot of the system. Let's say, for instance, you're in a voluntary control, it would apply to voluntary aided schools as well in terms of the Clark-Woodhead. Let's say, for instance, in your prospectus you said, or in your school website, you follow the national curriculum for RE. And then new head teachers, new governing body come in, they decide to change that. They want to, because they've had a SIAMS report and they've decided that they need to do something different because it's not fitting in with SIAMS. It says that on the website, but in practice that's not happening. What would happen then? So what legislators don't like is the idea of the differential right of withdrawal. That's a problem. Where in some schools, under some circumstances, you could withdraw, but from other schools you couldn't withdraw. And this goes right back to the discussions of the 1870 Elementary Education Act. Because it was all of those questions and all of those issues that then cemented the right to withdraw, both in terms of teachers and of pupils by parents, because it was realised that this is a really difficult area. So what lawmakers like is they like things to be quite clear. So I think how this would work in the future, I think is difficult. The other thing is, if religious education is going to broaden out, and is going to include non-religious worldviews, however we construct that, and the major religions with some minority religions as well, there's an issue there as well. what would that knowledge base look like for teachers? You know, and I think for secondary teachers, where people have specialist degree backgrounds, that's one question. For primary teachers, that's quite a different question. Given the amount of time that's spent on English and maths and science within the primary curriculum, what's the cost-benefit analysis in terms of how much they would need to know in order to be able to teach RE under the reformed concept? Does that make sense?
Kevin.
Just go back to the City of London. Obviously, DFE were obviously quite defensive and says you must re-establish your SACRE. One, I'm worried, well not worried, but surprised that they haven't issued any guidance without having to be reminded by SACREs that you need to get this one sorted out. And secondly, did they get people coming back onto that SACRE in City of London? Because I can't imagine people who want to join a body that effectively doesn't do anything apart from sit around, talk about something but has no impact. So did they manage to recruit in the City of London another SACRE body?
Well, I can tell you, yes, they did. I think partly because the City of London, in terms of groups B, C and D, the Church of England has a presence in the City of London. There's a small chapel there, isn't there? There is. Teacher associations are the City of London. That's one of the difficulties. It's just one of those places where very few people live because of the nature of the city itself. They were fortunate in it being able to draw on the wider population of Greater London. So, and there were people who were interested in that. I think how that might work in a place like the Isles of Scilly or Cumbria might be slightly different. Do you know what I mean? Because if you don't have larger populations where you can actually draw on people that you don't necessarily have in your own specific population, that becomes much more difficult.
That's your refreshments as well, I suspect.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Any further questions? Otherwise, we do have a recommendation that SACRE write to the Secretary of State, page 19. I think it's important that we do actually do that. Can I have a proposal? Thank you. Thank you. All in favour? Thank you very much. That's carried. Thank you. Item 9. The RE Council's Commission on Religious Education in England. Again, David's.
This will be very brief. It's just to let people know that the RE Council of England and Wales has set up a commission to look at religious education in England. That they will be consulting on this. I think what's slightly concerning at the moment is that there is an REC board meeting, I think on Thursday. At the moment, we have no idea who these commissioners are going to be. I was talking to somebody on the REC board who last week didn't know. So that's a bit worrying, isn't it, in terms of getting the process started. But once that is announced, I think it's quite important that all SACREs are involved in the consultation. I do think as well, one of the things that does concern me is that whenever you get these sorts of commissions, they are peculiarly urban. And I think giving the rural voice or the peripheral voice, I think is really, really important. So the first recommendation is, in fact, that SACRE commits itself to being part of any future consultation. The second one is to invite the commission or members of the commission actually to come to the Isles of Scilly to actually talk to people here about religious education and about what's important and why. So they get a different voice from that of just, people living in London or Manchester or Birmingham.
And what would be the timing of these two recommendations if they're...
Well, The commission is supposed to run for 2 years, an interim report this time next year, and the final report the year after that. So it's a 2-year process.
I was just,
Yeah, sorry, Kevin.
yeah, I'm just scanning through the people who are actually there, list of participants.
Yeah, I
I
do.
mean, it is surprising there's only, what I can see, 2 teachers who are actually in schools. I mean, I don't know whether that's, because when you are talking about what effectively is a real look at what's happening in schools and what should be the way forward and local, national, all of this, there must be obviously somewhere that's fed into that, but that does look, and it surprises me, there's just the 2 representatives of schools there. But
We're getting, as SACRE here, we've had
Yeah.
different reports from different people on religious education, and yet, we're not sure that actually the government are going to accept any of it, really, because there's a hesitance about changing legislation. So,
Yeah.
if I've read it correctly.
Yeah, if I may, Madam Chairman, I do think I do agree with Kevin in terms of people who are actually involved in teaching in schools. I'm trying to see exactly where my contribution was, because it was seen to be a minority contribution. I did get rather cross in the oh yeah, that's no, what
That's it. National Association.
no, I wasn't the chair. No.
Yeah.
I think 50 paragraph in that document, which is on page 40 of your agenda items, paragraph 53 and 54 were what I was saying. Partly because I think there's a very peculiar view about how religious education is working within schools, not based on research. So what I was doing was putting forward research as evidence. One of the participants there said that, so you want to leave agreed syllabuses to amateurs from a religious background, or something to those words. And actually, I did happen to know that that person at that time, who was a teacher and in a school, was actually a member of an agreed syllabus conference. I actually had never taught in a school which had to follow an agreed syllabus because they worked either in the church context or in an independent school. And I said, you're on one, is that how you would describe yourself? Is that what's happening in your process? And I said, on the whole, the problem with agreed syllabuses in many places, they've actually been written by teachers. And actually they work to quite a low common denominator, particularly secondary teachers. I said, and we have evidence for that. And he got really cross. And I said, but you can't argue with the evidence. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, you can argue with the evidence, but you have to have other evidence to show that that's not the case. And I said, one of the problems with the whole thing about this reform is so much of it is actually based in unsubstantiated opinion as opposed to evidence on the ground. But mine will seem to be a minority view. Yes, I was the minority perspective. It was after dinner to say that. But they did go out seething, some of them. And I just think, actually, if you really want to get good quality religious education, the key thing you've got to do is have good quality teachers who have had good quality training. Yeah. The syllabus itself is neither here nor there. I think it's also quite funny that they're asking for a national syllabus or national curriculum for RE, when actually the national curriculum itself doesn't have to be followed by academies which the government are promoting. Similarly, you don't have to be a qualified teacher in order to be able to teach in an academy. There's some really peculiar anomalies within the system.
Yeah, it's a lot of contradictions,
Yeah.
really. Any further comments? The recommendation is we become involved in the consultation. Presumably, we can't do that at the moment. And the Sacre to the Commission, and presumably we can't do that quite at the moment either.
But when
When it's up and running. Lovely, thank you. Do we all agree to that? Thank you. Excellent. And I think we move now to item 10, feedback from the National Association of the Sacre's AGM, and we have an oral report from Perrin.
Thank you, Chair. A lot of this really is, in a sense, we've heard it all before, but most of this won't surprise you. But I very much enjoyed the little trip to London. It was very good to see our advisor in a magisterial role, attempting to chair a national gathering, which once or twice slightly unruly, especially when it came to about democratic processes, which was very interesting. We don't want to delay us with that. But the other interesting sort of the general reflection is just to see the diversity of people belonging to Sacre. It's at a national level. It was very, very interesting, especially to see quite a number of people, leaders of other major world faiths and so on, just to remind us that actually it is a complex and interesting world out there, and all sorts of interesting people are in this world, and it's good to feel part of something that's rather larger. Especially where we're thinking in quite a narrow way here, one school and 2,000 people and so on. So I think it's very good, generally, from time to time, that people do go to national things from here, and I'm very grateful for it being made possible for me to do it, and that was a sort of a general impression. One of the other great things of the day was that we were able to hear from two eminent speakers. That is from Baroness Elizabeth Butler-Sloss and Professor Adam Dinham, each responsible for one of the major reports that we've looked at before here. And of course, while you can read the report and you can discuss it and you can look at the excellent summary of the reports that the advisor did for us, to actually hear someone themselves warming to their topic and to hear the questioning that goes afterwards, it actually brings it home in a way that just seeing the report doesn't. So that was it was really good to get those two people and to have Charles Clarke in the room as well. It was a very good, interesting time. In terms of content and what I bring back from it in terms of thinking about these issues more, is again, this won't surprise you, but how much consensus there was, both within the reports and also in the response of Sacre members to the reports, a consensus in terms of thinking about worship, about how we need a major rethink on collective worship, and about how ridiculous to have a law which is totally flouted and no one cares about it. And we put in its place something which is some kind of reflection time, which everyone has to be part of. That's probably a benefit rather than a loss. That was interesting. But also the end of an opt-out for parents from that, saying that actually if it isn't religious, if it isn't a collective worship anymore, if it's a chance to think about things that really matter together, then we need all to be in there to do that. In terms of RE, a consensus about some kind of national framework, although to different extents, as reflected in the other paper from the St George's House consultation as well, whether that should be light touch or more thoroughgoing. But we need to get our act together nationally if this is going to be taken seriously, and then what are the implications for Sacre, issues we've looked at before. Discussion about the inclusion of non-religious views, no surprise, as we've been discussing even earlier in this meeting. But two things which did strike me that were, I think, slightly new to me, and which I bring away from it. The first was about the way in which we treat religions that aren't our own and the way that they're taught. And that what we need to reflect is the lived reality of those religions, not some ideal we've got from some book about, what do Muslims believe? Well, they have the five pillars of Islam, and they all say their prayers regularly, exactly on the dot, 5 times a day, and so on. Well, the fact that they don't, of course, it's a vast difference of the way in which Muslims interpret that across the world, and much more relaxed in places like Morocco than they are in the Arabian Peninsula, and you can look at that with every religion. What's it really like to be a Hindu in Britain today? Not just on Diwali, but throughout the year. What's it really like? Looking at the religion, warts and all, looking at what it really boils down to for people living their lives. Very interesting, and that's a change from the way in which I was required to teach other religions when I was a teacher a few years ago. So it tended to be happy festivals and happy Hindus going here and happy Muslims doing their thing. In fact, the reality is much more complicated, and so the gritty reality that we need to get that sense in the way we teach religions, not just the theory. And the second overall impression I got, I think, was a kind of renewed commitment to the importance of religion in the most general sense and spirituality to human flourishing, the real educational benefit of this being an integral part of the curriculum, not for confessional purposes. I want to do that as well, of course, as a priest, but I'm going to do that largely in church for people that want to come there. There's a different and equally important task of seeing what these shared values are in terms of human flourishing. And we don't understand human flourishing unless we understand the spiritual dimension that's part of that. And I think a renewed commitment to that, which was shared across the board, is the overall biggest impression I brought back from the meeting, which was very good. And thank you for allowing me to go to represent you.
Thank you, Perrin. That's actually very interesting, especially that, the last bit, around the renewed commitment to. No, it's good. Thank you very much. Item 11. Any other business notified to the Chair of Sacre before the meeting? A letter sent to the local authority with regard to Interfaith Week. Do you know anything about that, anybody?
I did have a chance to meet with the executive director of the Interfaith Network, who told me that all local authorities had been sent a letter to remind them about Interfaith Week 2016, which this year is in the 13th to the 20th of November. So I just thought I'd bring that up just to say that has been sent, quite who got it and where it went. It's quite interesting.
You haven't received anything, Andy? No? All right.
So, but it's just, there has been a commitment to supporting Interfaith
Yes,
Network.
we have. We've never quite achieved it yet, have
no.
we, for one thing and another?
And I think there is a concern as well, slightly different with the Isles of Scilly, given that there's only the one school, but I think there's a concern nationally that because of many schools no longer being part of the local authority's family, that actually they just don't get these messages, because traditionally those went from the local authority to schools just to let people know that was no longer happening. So it's just to highlight that there is an Interfaith Week this year, and it's the 13th to the 20th of November 2016.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of the agenda items. But before I close the meeting, I'm very much aware that this is Kevin and Charlie's last meeting that they will be present at. So I would very much like to thank them for their presence and their very valued contribution in the time that they have been here. So thank you both very much, and we wish Charlie a happy retirement, and we wish all goes well for Kevin when he moves on. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And that's right, and that does bring us to the end of the meeting, so thank you very much.